Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I'm a principal researcher in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Matthew Heckathorn, an integration engineer with the SEI CERT division. We're here to talk about his recent work on developing Ansible roles, particular type of role in infrastructure as code and DevSecOps, with confidence. Welcome, Matt. May I call you Matt?
Yeah.
Great. So you're new to our podcast series, and what we like to do before we get into your work is tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the SEI, and what is it that an integration engineer does that's really cool.
Well, so I've been at the SEI now for 13 years. I've been here for quite a long time. I actually started out as an intern. I did my master's degree over at the University of Pittsburgh, which is right up the street from the office. And there was a man who taught a class there named Sid Faber. He used to work at the SEI. And so I ended up as an intern for him after I had him as a teacher. And I never left. I've been here for a very long time. I've bounced around from a bunch of different teams here. I actually started out assisting with the vulnerability disclosure department here at CERT. And then I switched to the network situational awareness team, and I did some network monitoring work here. I taught a few classes at FlowCon on Silk,
Nice.
which is our NetFlow monitoring tool. And then I got really into automation, and in particular, I got really into system administration automation. And so I started dabbling my toes into Ansible and into Terraform and some other tools. And I ended up on a team that managed a data center for a government sponsor here. And so that was where I became an integration engineer. And so my primary role is mostly in automation, in particular, around this idea of DevOps, right? So, and it's mostly infrastructure automation is what I mostly do. I dabble in things like CI/CD pipelines. I dabble in infrastructure as code. Like I mentioned, Ansible, Terraform. It's all about automating the deployment and configuration of IT data centers. And so I get to work with some cutting edge stuff. I get to work with some particularly really interesting tools. And I get to automate as much stuff as I want, which is always really fun. That's what I do here.
So one of the things, my experience working with folks like you is that you're wonderful at automating the things that are routine and boring, right? And so kicking off, a build, there's a whole bunch of things in system administration, as well as in managing a DevSecOps pipeline that are very repetitive and things you have to do a lot. And you have to do things like destroy the old environment before you can have a clean environment to test in again and things like that. And so that's really the point of some of these tools like Ansible and some of the other tools you're going to talk about, is to help engineers to kind of get that boring stuff, but has to be done, automated so that they can really focus on the intellectually challenging aspects of whatever it is that they're developing, right?
Yeah, you're pretty on point, right? So the main thing that I'm mostly tasked with here is standing up fresh environments that are configured the way that we want them to be configured, right? And we want them to come up correctly the first time, every time,
right?
And there's this adage in DevSecOps in the DevOps world of treating your infrastructure not like a pet, but treating it like cattle. The idea is that if there's a problem with my infrastructure, I don't bother putting a lot of effort into trying to fix it. It's not a pet, right? I will just get rid of the old infrastructure and create it fresh from a fresh state. And now I don't have to worry about debugging it anymore, right? It saves us a lot of time and effort. And that's where a lot of these tools like Ansible or Terraform, these infrastructure as code tools really start to shine, is it enables us to automate and be confident that it's going to come back up, right? We're not going to destroy something and then, where did everything go, right? That's really their main purpose.
And it's that confidence that we can recreate. That is one of the things that makes using the cloud and using DevSecOps pipelines as a foundation for giving us confidence in our code that are really important. The pet analogy: don't name your infrastructure, right? It's like don't name it if you're gonna destroy it later. All right, so getting into Ansible itself, you recently wrote a blog post that provides some wonderful guidance on how to begin developing what Ansible calls roles. And let's talk about what is the function that roles play in Ansible and how are they different from the roles. When we usually hear the word roles, we think about people, systems engineer, architect, things like that. So what is different about the way Ansible defines roles, and why is it critical that the Ansible roles function the way that we intend them to?
Right. So the first part of that question is basically, what is an Ansible role, right? And so an Ansible role, if you've ever done any development work in your life or anything like that, right? It's kind of like a function or an object in an object-oriented programming. Right? It's this idea that we have a reusable piece of code, right? In the Ansible world, that role, that reusable piece of code, is easily shareable, right? We package it up. And we can share it around to publicly. We can share it around internally, privately, and it really enables us to have a common configuration for that particular role. Now that leads into your second part of that, the latter half of that question, which is basically what's the difference between an Ansible role and like a role like a person, a sysadmin or something like that. They're actually kind of similar. Like an Ansible role would be like a web server. So this particular node, it is going to have a role of web server. And then this other particular node is going to have a role of database server, and so on, right? So it's not too different from a person having a sysadmin role or a DevOps engineer role, right? There's a different purpose for the node, and we give it a role. Now, a web server role, that is very generalized, right? At the end of the day, Ansible roles are a little bit more specific than that, right? So, for example, if we go back to the web server example, there are different types of web servers. There's an HTTPD, Apache web server. There's NGINX web server. There's all kinds of different web server software out there. So you might have an Ansible role for NGINX, or you might have an Ansible role for Apache HTTPD, right? And so technically at that point, your role is less generalized. We're talking about, this is the NGINX role. Its purpose is to deploy and configure the NGINX software suite, right? We can generalize that and say, web server role calls NGINX role if we wanted to. But we don't have to get that generalized when we're talking about Ansible. We can just simply call a role called NGINX, and now our node is a web server, right? Because it has running the NGINX software suite.
So I come from a different generation. I come from the, my first, program was written in the 1970s. So, whole different infrastructure mindset. And the way I kind of resolved it in my own head is a role has a set of responsibilities to execute. Systems engineer has a certain set of responsibilities. A reliability engineer, who is a specialized systems engineer, is even more specific. And so I kind of think about the Ansible roles that way, that they are a role that performs a purpose in the way that a human does, with some response, but it has specific responsibilities. And that's the part that actually gets complicated, is in terms of writing those responsibilities for that role so that they are correct for the environment that you're trying to configure. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. And then, additionally, one other thing is that Ansible roles can actually rely on other roles, just like people have to rely on other people, right? And so you can have requirements in your roles that are essentially like, oh, before you deploy NGINX, you have to make sure that like the EPEL repo is there or something like that. That's a, just super general example, but
Right.
That you're able to kind of layer them, right, in a way where it's like this role requires this role and this role requires this role, right? Another good example, right? So we here at the SEI, we publish a NetFlow monitoring tool called YAF, yet another flow meter. YAF requires the fixbuff C library to be installed. Okay. And I actually have some open source Ansible roles for managing that software suite. And so my YAF role relies on the fixbuff role, right? So there's a good example of some nested stuff there.
So Ansible roles have become are strongly used, I guess, or often used in infrastructure as code for obvious reasons, because they can set up a set of conditions and a set of activities that are going to allow us to configure the next test increment or the next test configuration or the next development configuration that we want to use in a particular environment. Why would you need to go beyond the Ansible roles that have already been published? There have been a lot of Ansible roles that are published already.
So Red Hat owns the Ansible tool, right? And there is a web service out there called Ansible Galaxy. It's galaxy.ansible.com. And that is where you would go to kind of find the Ansible roles that are published out there. Now, under the hood, Ansible is really just doing a Git clone or a Git pull. It actually is pulling the roles from a Git repo. So you technically can get them from any Git repositories, GitHub, GitLab, any of the public ones, or your private Git repos inside your company. You could get them from there, which kind of leads into why you might want to develop your own, right? So, like, for example, let's say that you are your company and you're releasing a new application and you want to have some common configuration for that. And you might want to support not just containerizing your app through something like Docker, but you would also want to support like allowing people to install it on the server itself, right, on the host. So you would use a tool like Ansible for that. You could develop that role internally, right, before you publish it externally for your customers. Additionally, in our line of work, we often have government contractors that have like different sets of requirements, right? Where it's never going to be public, right? We have to pull from different sets of resources or different things like that, and so that allows us to develop that role internally that way as well. And then additionally, Ansible Galaxy, while there are roles out there for doing different things, sometimes they might not do what you want them to do. Right? So Red Hat owns it, but the roles are really published by the community. And so the quality of roles is kind of all over the map, right? Like you might have some roles out there that, you're just like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever found. And then you might find a role for a piece of software. You're like, oh, okay, like this doesn't do anything. It's broken. It's out of date. Right. And so there's a lot of reasons why you might sit down and write your own role. I will say, though, that you should check first, right? Like you don't want to sit down and just write a role unless you're trying to learn, right? You don't want to sit down and just write a role for something that's out there that already does what you want, right? The first thing you want to do is sit down and look, right? And that actually is a useful experience as well, because you might find something that is 90% of the way there.
Right.
And you're like, all right, well, I just need to tweak a few things in this role, and now it does exactly what I want. So because it's just in a Git repo and it's often hosted on GitHub, you can simply fork that role, add the functionality, and then see if you can get it pulled back upstream. Or, if it's no longer an active role, which I've had to do before, like the maintainer has moved on, I'll just maintain it myself going forwards, right? So there's a number of reasons for writing your own roles. And I've just kind of gone through a whole bunch of them.
well, and the learning function, I mean, that's another one is you do want to, sometimes that's the best way to learn something is to try and write one on your own.
Right.
But one of the things that you talk about in your blog post is there are also now some tools that will help you to write roles so that you don't have to learn. Somebody like me, I am just not ready to go there. So I'm going to want to use tools like you mentioned, like Molecule, that are going to give me some templates, give me some guidance, and are going to help me to do that. So talk a little bit about what that class of tools helps you with in terms of writing Ansible roles.
Right. So when you first start out writing an Ansible role, right? So the purpose behind Ansible is it's an infrastructure as code tool, right? And it falls under a class of infrastructure as code tools that's more targeted towards configuration management.
Mm-hmm.
The other class is orchestration. And while Ansible can do that, it neatly falls under the configuration management bucket. The idea is that, you use Ansible to configure a service or an application on some remote server, right? So when you first sit down to write it, you sit down at your Mac laptop or your Windows or Linux laptop, right? And oftentimes when we're talking about configuring a remote server, we're most of the time talking about Linux servers. There are Windows servers and so on, right? But a lot of times we're configuring Linux. So if I'm sitting on my Mac and I want to start targeting a Linux server, I now need a Linux server, right? And so now, in order for me to do that, I need to figure out some way of standing up my infrastructure and managing that infrastructure just for testing, right? Just for development work and testing work. And so you could, if you wanted to, you could sit down and you could use something like HashiCorp Vagrant's tool to stand up a virtual machine on your laptop. You run a command, you get an Ubuntu virtual machine, and then you open the ports, you make sure you can get to it, and then you tell Ansible, okay, target this. This is the Linux machine, all right? You could also use your IT services infrastructure, right, instead. Maybe they're running a vSphere cluster, VMware vSphere cluster. They could manage it for you, right? They could stand up the machine for you, give you the connection information, and you could be like, all right, Ansible, this is my remote server, right? The problem you have, though, especially when you're starting out, is side effects, right? So when you're writing a role, let's go back to the NGINX example, right? I'm trying to write a role. I want to create an NGINX service running on a Linux box, right? So I have to install NGINX and I have to configure it to do what I want it to do. I want it to listen on port 80. I want it to listen on port 443. I want it to redirect traffic between the two, so on, right? So I go out, I write my role, I push go. Ansible connects to that remote Linux machine or that virtual machine on my laptop, and it installs NGINX. It drops in the configuration files where it needs to go, and then it starts the NGINX service. Now, if you're great and you're amazing at this, it comes up correctly the first time, done, move on with your life, right?
That's not me.
Yeah. So most of the time, it doesn't. Most of the time, you make a little mistake where you put a period where you didn't mean to in the configuration file, or you screwed up, you messed up the syntax in some way, or you didn't install the right package, right? Because package names are different between different types of operating systems. So what happens? All right, well, now you got to debug. Why didn't NGINX come up? So you log into that remote server or that virtual machine and you try to figure it out. All right, so you go into the configuration file. Oh, there's a period. I delete the period, and then I save the file. I restart the service. All right, that's it. So you go back to your Ansible code. You find where your bug was. You fix it, and then you rerun your Ansible code. So what's going to happen? Well, it connects to that server. Well, remember, you already logged into that server to debug, and you already fixed the error. So what Ansible is going to do is it's going to try to drop in a replacement configuration file, but it's going to notice that it doesn't have to. So it's not going to do it. It's going to move on. And then it's not going to restart the service, right? Because it doesn't have to. The service is already restarted. It's already working. So essentially, that second time you ran it after you debugged your problem, it didn't do anything.
Right.
So if you start from a fresh server, is it going to work right the first time? You don't know. You're uncertain now. And so what you could do is you could log back into that server and you could uninstall NGINX and you could delete the configuration file and you could try to track down any other traces of things that were put in place. And then you could rerun the Ansible role. Now, of course, there's always little things that happened, in between. There might be some manual stuff that you did that you forgot about when you were debugging. And so you're still not 100% certain that if you start from a fresh server, that role is going to work, right? So the best thing for you to do would be to destroy that testing infrastructure and recreate it. Now, if you're talking about a virtual machine on your laptop, that might take a few minutes, right? You run a Vagrant command to destroy it, or you click through the GUI in VirtualBox, right? Or whatever you're using. And then you recreate it, make sure you can connect to it, and then rerun your Ansible role, right? And that's fine. A few minutes, it's not bad. I mean, it's a little manual, right? Because you gotta run the commands. You could write a script to do it yourself, write a bash script or something that does it, right? It's not terrible. If you're talking about like remote infrastructure that your IT services team is handling for you, that's going to take longer, right? You probably have to put in a ticket or something. If you're handling it yourself, it's still going to take longer, a few minutes and stuff like that. So especially if you're trying to develop this and you're making mistakes a lot, right? Like it gets annoying very quickly. And you could try to roll your own, tool for handling it, or you could see if there was something out there for handling it for you, which is what Molecule is, right? So Molecule.
Where was Molecule in the 70s? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, well, so Molecule is a tool that is really just for Ansible, right? So the idea behind Molecule is it handles the complete life cycle of your Ansible development or testing environments, right? And then it does a bunch of other stuff, right? So beyond just handling the infrastructure, you can have it kick off, other tools, things like linters or, testing frameworks. You can have it kick off, what else? It'll pull in requirements for you. So if you have like Galaxy requirements, like if your role relies on another role, it'll pull those in for you. And then it also handles this idea of checking for idempotence, right? So in the Ansible world, it's very important. You only want to change things if they need to be changed, and you want it to come up correctly.
I want to interrupt you for just a second, because a lot of people that are not deep into this world do not understand what I can never say it right. Idempotence.
Yeah. So it's this concept that, no matter how many times you execute your Ansible role, it only changes things that it needs to change, right? It achieves the same result over and over and over again. That's the baseline definition of idempotence, right? Same thing over and over and over again, right? And so essentially
and it's a great word. But you gotta explain it the first time.
It's a software engineering term, right? So of course, great word. Essentially what that boils down to in the Ansible tool world is you run the role and it does its stuff. And then you run the role again. And if your role is idempotent, nothing should happen the second time, right? It should just power through, and every step, nothing should get changed, right? Because it got changed the first time, right? There might be some one-offs and stuff like that where that you need that to not be the case, and I've certainly run into those. But in general, like, you don't want your Ansible role to make a bunch of changes, and then when you rerun it, to make a whole bunch of changes again. You want it to make all the changes it needs the first time it runs. And Molecule helps you with that, right? Molecule just does it. And then if something changed the second time around, it tells you, all right, well, your role's not idempotent. And then you got to go back in and debug and figure out why, right? So it's a very powerful tool. And that's without diving too deep. What's our next question?
Well, you go into a great deal of depth in the blog post. And so I would say for people that have gotten to this point and go, oh, I need to understand all of this, go to the blog post, because you give some wonderful examples of things that you can do and what the ways in which Molecule can help you with your Ansible roles. But I also noted in the blog post that you also had a few cautions in terms of, you're using Molecule, but what are some things to be careful of if you're new to this particular tool set and using it? So why don't you give us a couple of those?
Right. So when you first get started with Molecule, right, one of the provisioners that it can use is Docker. Okay, and
a very common provisioner.
Yeah, and the beauty behind it is, I mentioned that if you were to stand up virtual machines on your laptop, it might take you minutes to destroy them and recreate them, which isn't very long. With Docker, we're talking about seconds, right? It takes us seconds to destroy a Linux operating system and recreate it, right? And additionally, with Docker, we can use Molecule to target a variety of different operating systems and operating system versions, right? So we can sort of create a matrix of different things that we want to support. Like, so let's say, for example, back to the NGINX example, I want to write a role for NGINX that works across Debian, Red Hat, Red Hat 7, Red Hat 8, Debian 10, Debian 11. Well, in Molecule, that's simple. In my Molecule file, I just add a bunch of different areas in there, call in my different Docker containers, and it'll stand them up in parallel. It'll run, the role against them all, and it'll give you feedback on which ones worked and which ones didn't. The gotchas, though, are containers are not full operating systems, right? They're containers, so they don't have everything that you need. They're missing, oftentimes the base containers are missing things like systemd, which if we're talking about services in the Linux world, well, you need it. So you do kind of need to, you get into this sort of all right, I'm starting with a new role. I got to figure out, well, what is my baseline Molecule configuration? Luckily, there's a lot of people out there that have been doing this for a while. In the blog post, I call out a guy. His name's Jeff Geerling. He's written a book on Ansible. He's got a bunch of YouTube videos on it. He's presented at some Ansible fests and stuff. He has some great Ansible roles out there. So oftentimes when I first start writing a new role, I go to one of his Ansible roles and I look at his Molecule configuration file and I look and I'm like, all right, this is how I want mine to be, right? So what he's relying on is he also maintains a set of Docker containers that have things like systemd in it already and have things like Ansible in it already, right? So that you can kind of ignore a lot of the things about, Docker containers not being full-blown operating systems, right? There's a few tweaks that you also need to maintain in the Molecule file, and it's in that blog post as well. It's from Jeff Geerlings, which is, you need to mount certain things inside the container, right? You need to make it basically so that the Docker container oftentimes has access to the Docker socket and stuff like that for it to work legitimately like a real operating system. Right. So that's really like the main gotcha is like, all right, like you want to use something like a container because we're talking seconds versus minutes here, right? It's crazy how fast your development cadence can be, right? When you just can destroy it and recreate it, and it takes almost no time to you, right? It's like, oh, I messed that up. All right, goodbye, and now I'm back, right? Seconds versus minutes doesn't seem like a lot, but it kind of really adds up. So you do want to use containers, and so you do need to try to avoid some of these gotchas, right? So yeah, that's the main one. The major one is that one. There's some other ones that I mentioned in there, but in general, it's like it's just a different mindset, right? I'm not in a full host OS, right? I'm in a container, so I got to be a little careful.
Okay, that's good advice. So if I'm a developer and I want to start creating new roles in the Ansible sandbox, where would I begin? What resources and tools? You mentioned Jeff Geerling's work. What are some other things that are available to me that I should be looking at to have the best experience in learning this?
Well, so I sort of mentioned, like you said, Jeff Geerling's GitHub repos are a really good starting point. There's also the Molecule blog post that we have out there, right? And it gives you a good starting point for how to get started with the tool. And then in general, like the Red Hat Ansible documentation is actually very good. I find it extremely well written. There's lots of good examples. And the Ansible Galaxy is also a good place to start as well. What you tend to do when you start using Ansible is you find an author on Galaxy that writes roles that you think are well written. And so you'll look for something and you'll be like, oh, I know that name. I'll look at his role first, right? Jeff Geerling is a good example of that. All of his roles are pretty well written. But I found other ones out there, right, where I'll be like, I'll recognize their picture or something like on Ansible Galaxy, and I'll be like, oh, all right, and I'll start there. In general, like the best way to start is to get your dev environment set up, which the blog post calls out how to do, and then to start kind of messing around. And the beauty of using something like Molecule is, well, it's all local. It's all on my laptop, right? I don't have to rely on my IT services team to stand up infrastructure for me. Right. You know, I don't even have to really, like, because we're relying on people that have done a lot of the legwork for us, things like Jeff Geerling, or if you want to look at my open source GitHub repos for this work as well, which is on the SEI GitHub. You know, you can just kind of copy and paste our Molecule configs and start with them, right? Yep, and it's like, all right, like now I know what I got to start in config. I write Molecule tests and I'm off to the races, right? So that's the beauty of the tool. You can pick it up and move it around because it's just using Docker under the hub. It'll run the same on your laptop as it does on mine. You know, it's a great way of getting started, and it really does kind of help with the learning curve. I've always found Ansible, in comparison to some of the other infrastructure as code tools, to having like a shallower learning curve as it is. Like, it's a lot easier to get started in, but this really lowers the barrier to entry a lot using a tool like Molecule.
So one of the things you mentioned in your post is that Ansible roles themselves can benefit from a DevSecOps approach. So we've got kind of a circular thing that going on of we use Ansible in the service of a DevSecOps pipeline. But talk for a minute about how would I think about the DevSecOps approach to writing Ansible roles?
Right. So DevSecOps really is this idea of thinking about security throughout the entire DevOps pipeline, right? And the DevOps pipeline is that infinity loop that you've probably all seen. If you haven't, you know, the idea is that you start planning, you code, you build, you test, you release, you deploy, you operate, you monitor, and you're back at the beginning, right? That's the DevOps loop. And security, the DevSecOps pipeline, there's a big security bubble around the whole thing where you're thinking about security throughout. So with that being said, you know, when we're designing our Ansible roles and we want to think about it from that philosophy, we can think about adding security in early, right, during the planning stages and stuff like that. So, for example, back to the NGINX example, if I'm running an NGINX server and I want it to be more secure, I probably want to enable TLS, right? I want to enable encryption on that server. And so when you're designing your Ansible role, you put that during the planning phase and say, we need to provide support for, you know, security from the beginning. We need to provide support for allowing our users of this role to enable and configure TLS. You know, you can put it in early like that in the plan stage. But then additionally, I sort of mentioned this, Molecule has the ability to call linters, or you can call linters yourself. So there are linters out there for YAML lint because Ansible code is written in YAML. I tend to use YAML lint. That one is sort of an early DevSecOps tool, right? It's this sort of static analyzer of your Ansible code. And it really is more targeted towards like giving you a common like look and feel to your code, right? So if you write this and you run your YAML linter against it and somebody else writes it in your organization, another role, and they run the YAML lint, if you were to look at the two YAML files side by side, you're going to have a common look to them, right? They're going to be formatted similarly and stuff like that, right? YAML lint adds a little bit of that to it, which is good because, you know, we're all people and we all need to be able to look at each other's code And so it's helpful if everyone is using some standard format, right? And that'll add some leverage that'll add a little bit of security. It's not straight security targeted, but it usually falls under the static analyzer bucket. And then additionally, there's another one called Ansible lint, which tries to enforce some best practices for your Ansible code, right? So YAML lint is look and feel. Ansible lint would be things like, you shouldn't use the command module. You should try to use something like this, right? So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit higher level than just the look and feel. It's more like, we suggest that you don't use these modules in this way, right? Because it's not best practice. Whether or not it's a security issue or not, but it falls under that like static analyzer bucket thing. So there's that. And then finally, Molecule also has the capability of calling testing frameworks, like I mentioned. And so I tend to use one called Test Infra, right, which is a Python library. And so what will happen during the test phase of my Molecule matrix, it'll hand it off to Test Infra. And I'll write some Python-based tests in there to check things. So I'll check and make sure that the NGINX service is started. You could write tests in there to make sure that TLS is enabled and working, right? So during the testing phase, you can add some security-related tests in to make sure that things are working there. So you really, with DevSecOps, right, like back to what I said, you're kind of trying to think about it from every step in the DevOps pipeline. So, planning stages would be adding security in early on. And then the testing phase, right, is where we're calling like something like test infra and checking for it there. So that's sort of how you would think about it from like a DevSecOps perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. I want to know what you're working on now. So you've written this blog post, you've sort of done a bunch of this work. What are you working on now that we're going to be able to bring you back to talk about in 6 months?
Well, so I do a lot of work with containerization. I work with Kubernetes and Docker containers and stuff like that. I also do a lot of work with cloud infrastructure and automation. One of the things I've been tossing around for a while now is how do you work with like a tool like Terraform in a team setting, right? It's really easy to get up and running with Terraform as an individual. But there's a lot of considerations and even a lot of, not a lot, but there's some infrastructure that's required if you're going to start moving into running Terraform as a team. There's some like pre-baked stuff out there that you could utilize. Terraform, HashiCorp has their own cloud like HCP thing offering now. But if I wanted to kind of like stand up infrastructure and start using Terraform the right way as a team with like, people like reviewing my Get pulls and stuff like that, or Get pull requests, I'm sorry. How do I do that? And so that's kind of my next thing that I'm looking at, is that.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to having another conversation with you when you get a little farther with that work. I want to thank you very much for talking to us today. And I know that it's difficult to converse about these kinds of things without having a code listing in your hand. And I really thank you for having that conversation. I want to tell our listeners and our audience that we will include links to lots of stuff. We've talked about many resources. We will link to those in the transcript, and including Matt's blog post, of course, on this topic, which is one of our primary references. So a reminder to our audience, finally, that our podcasts are available everywhere. SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google, everybody in the world. And of course, if you want the video, you got to go to the SEI's YouTube channel. So we hope that some of you will do that as well. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us, especially Matt, and everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.